Former atheist Lee Strobel set out to discover the truth about Christianity. He met with professor called Craig Bloomberg. Now, Craig Bloomberg is a New Testament scholar. He's also got a professor of law degree at Yale. And so what Lee Strobel was trying to discover was, would the gospel stand up against scrutiny? Much in the same way when a witness is on the stand and being questioned, how does the Gospels hold up under those set of circumstances? And what he came up with was 5 key points. You have the cover-up test, you have the consistency test, you also have the character test, the corroboration test, and the adverse witness test. Now we're going to run through each one of these one by one, a little bit more in depth. Real quick, by the way, guys, my name is Daniel Wilson. Welcome to Faith and Fit. I'm a Christian, lived with an atheist for a year, had no idea how to defend my faith, and I don't want you to be one of those Christians. Well, let's get into it. All right, guys, so starting with the cover-up test, basically the best way that I can describe this is, let's say 2 people get into a fight. You only talk to one other person. You don't see the other guy, but you talk to one person. He has 2 black eyes, and you ask him who won the fight. He says, oh, clearly I did. I beat the mess out of this dude. He didn't even get off a single punch. Now you're looking at him. He's got 2 black eyes. So clearly those 2 black eyes came somewhere, but apparently he's saying that he didn't get hit. Okay, somewhere something isn't adding up. So much in the same way, are there any, when we're looking at the cover-up test and we're comparing that to the Gospels, are there any outstanding claims? Is there anything that doesn't make sense, or is there anything that doesn't fit? Is there any in area in particular where they're clearly lying? Okay, so what we do is, or one of the key points that Sean points out is the embarrassing details about the disciples. In Mark chapter 9 verse 32, you have the disciples arguing over who was the greatest amongst them. That's like immature siblings. You have in Matthew, Peter denying Jesus 3 times. You know, this is a disciple that we're talking about denying Jesus. You also have Jesus calling Peter Satan. Get behind me, Satan. Now, these were the apostles were leaders of the early church when these stories were written. If they were trying to strengthen the movement, then why would they include these details? And then you also have the teachings that are hard to understand. When Jesus was on the cross and he cries out, Father, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? I know I myself have wondered about that verse. You also have in John chapter 5, verse 19, Jesus says, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he seeth the Father do. Mark chapter 6, verse 5, and he could there do no mighty works, save that he laid his hand upon a few sick folk, talking about when he's in his hometown, and the people that he was raised with, they don't believe him. You know, a prophet is considered a prophet except in his hometown. Basically, he could only do so many miracles because of their unbelief. And he's in Matthew chapter 24, verse 36, when he's talking about the end times, says, but of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Now, I don't know about you, but I have wondered about these verses. As Christians, we believe Jesus is the Son of God, but we also believe he is God. It's that Trinity. And if he's God, then how is his power limited? Why couldn't he heal everyone regardless of their unbelief? How does he not know the end times? When he's on the cross, who is he talking to when he says, Father, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Now, with that being said, there are good theological explanations for these sayings, but that's another video for another time. What I'm basically trying to point out is, wouldn't it have been a lot easier for these passages to just been omitted, to have been left out? You know, nothing to see here, but instead we get the easy to understand with the not so easy to understand. And basically, based off of that evidence, I think that we can deduce the authors were being as accurate and as honest and not leaving anything out as possible. Okay, so that's basically the cover-up test. We're going to move on to the consistency test. The consistency test. Basically what we're measuring right here, do the stories in question that are relaying the same events agree with one another, or are they constantly contradicting each other? Now, the stories in question we're referring to is the Gospels. And for the Gospels, one of the biggest critiques that you'll hear is that they are contradictory. They're not so much contradictory. There are small changes within the gospel, so the consistency test allows for small changes within the story. That they sometimes the gospels would refer to the same event, but maybe different characters or different details. For example, Sean is talking about in Matthew when a centurion speaks to Jesus, and then in Luke he records that two elders are speaking for the centurion. So with that, we can conclude that centurions are communicating to Jesus. Now, like I said, they're small changes, but they're describing the same events. And in my opinion, this makes the Gospels that much more believable. For example, if you have two people that see a car wreck, one might describe that a car ran into a truck in a head-on collision, while the second person might say a red car T-boned the truck and the driver of the truck was life flighted to Grady. As a matter of fact, you yourself, if you tell the same story three different times, you're probably going to mention different details. You're the same person telling the same story, and it's going to be told three different ways. In my opinion, that makes the Gospels that much more believable. It's evidence that they didn't just copy each other, and they're being as accurate and honest as possible. Sean also records in in Mark and John when Jesus is on trial. Mark's account is short and straightforward, with Jesus not saying much and Pilate, not declaring Jesus' innocence. And then you have in John, his account is a lot longer, with Jesus having a lot more to say to Pilate, and Pilate declaring Jesus to be innocent. From here, we can conclude that Pilate and Jesus are talking. Now maybe what they're saying is like it's being told from different perspectives, but the overarching theme of the Gospels is that Jesus was born of a virgin. He died on the cross. He was crucified for our sins, and he was resurrected on the third day. They're being told from different perspectives. They're not contradictory, but complementary. So the stories are similar enough that they pass the consistency test, but also different enough that we have evidence to believe that they didn't just copy each other. As a matter of fact, if they were exactly the same, I think that would be evidence as to maybe they're not as accurate. Anyways, that's the consistency test. Moving on to the character test. We have the character test. Now, what we're analyzing right here is, did the writers of the Gospels intend for the stories to be taken as historically accurate, but intentionally lie about certain details? To answer this question, first we have to ask, well, what would have been their motive to lie? Usually people lie for either material or societal gain, but all throughout the Gospels, we're seeing that the opposite happened. Either they were imprisoned, persecuted. As a matter of fact, we have a lot of evidence to believe that most of the apostles would end up dying for their faith. Secondly, you have the principle of embarrassing details, and you have James, Jesus' own brother, basically being called James, calling Jesus crazy. Why include that passage if not for the sake of accuracy? Secondly, you have the apostles repeatedly being shown as C students. There's so many passages in the Gospels that end with, and they did not understand. You have, in Mark, when the apostles couldn't cast out the devil, and they had to ask Jesus to do it, and they asked him privately, why couldn't we do it? They didn't know, and Jesus said, this type only comes out by prayer and fasting. You have in Mark chapter 9, verse 31 and 32, when Jesus is teaching them about the Son of Man having to be delivered and killed, and they understood not, but were afraid to ask him to clarify. You have Mark chapter 8, 14 through 17, when the disciples forgot to take bread with them, and they didn't have any bread on the ship. And Jesus charged them. He said, take heed. And they thought it was because they didn't have any bread. And in verse 17, he says, "Why reason ye? Because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not, nor understand?" Basically asking them, do you not remember when I fed the 5,000 with just a couple of fish and chips? Where's your faith? And then you have the women discovering the empty tomb. The reason that's important is because a woman's testimony back then was not as credible as a man's testimony. Why include that if not for the sake of accuracy? And I think to sum it all up, we can conclude that the writers were more concerned with honesty and accuracy versus how they were going to be perceived or their reputation. Moving on, we have the corroboration test. The corroboration test, it's exactly what it sounds like, is they're corroborating evidence that can verify names, places, dates, or events within the Gospels. For example, there's been a lot of archaeological discoveries in the past 100 years that can corroborate the Gospels. One that really stands out to me is the Pilate inscription, because up until this discovery, people denied the fact that Pilate even existed. But in 1961, you have this Italian archaeologist, Antonio Frova. He discovered an inscription at the Caesarea Maritima Theater, and the inscription, it was in Latin, and it contained 4 lines, 3 of which were legible. The first line read Tiberium, the second line read Pontius Pilate, and the third line read Prefect of Judea. The inscription is verifying that for a time during Pilate's rulership, he held the title of prefect, which is also another term for governor, and that's how the New Testament refers to Pilate. And also there's a lot of external outside sources that can corroborate the Bible. For example, you have this writer Suetonius. He corroborates the events that happened in Acts chapter 18 verse 2 when when the Jews were expelled from Rome. And I'll read the passage from Acts, and then I'll read the passage from Suetonius. So in Acts 18:2, when the emperor commanded all Jews to leave in Rome, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. Now, that's the passage from the Bible. Here's the passage from Suetonius. As the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. And then here's the second one. Punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a body of people addicted to a novel and mischievous superstition. So right there, he's corroborating the fact that the Jews were kicked out of Rome, and also corroborating the fact that they were severely persecuted. So that's the corroboration test. Moving on, we're going to get into the adverse witness test. The adverse witness test, what do the critics have to say about Jesus and the Gospels? Do they object to him ever existing? Do they object to his teachings? Do they totally dismantle the entire premise? Bloomberg points out that a lot of the Jewish writers claim Jesus was a magician, he was a prophet, he was a great teacher, which raises an interesting point. They could have claimed that Jesus never existed, that he never performed any miraculous miracles, but instead they felt the need to call him a sorcerer or a magician. If they felt the need to call him that does give us evidence to believe that something miraculous happened. In the Quran, it talks about Jesus being a great prophet, and also that he didn't die on the cross, but Allah made it seem as if he did die on the cross. Now, all of these things don't necessarily make the Gospels true, but it does give us evidence to point that something happened, that these authors aren't just completely making it up out of the blue. So point by point, I think the Bible passes all of these tests pretty reliable, but don't take it from me. Study the Word for yourself and come to your own conclusions. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, like the video, give it a comment. Again, this is Faith and Fit, and I'll see you next week.